I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We've got what I think is going to be a very interesting roundtable discussion about this year's book, The Unthinkable, and hopefully all of you have had the chance to take a look at it and read through the offering and kind of get a feel for some of the challenges that we're up against. Maybe there are things that happen that sometimes are out of our control, and people do react to them in different ways. And so we've got a great group here to talk about that with you today. I will introduce the folks here and then hand it over to Adrian, and he will facilitate the discussion portion. Across the table here, we've got Chad Currier, who's the Chief Information Security Officer here at K-State. Dr. Gary Brace, who is the department head in the Psychological Sciences Group. Dr. Katerina Scolio, professor in Electrical and Computer Engineering, and Dr. Jim Stack, who's professor in plant pathology. Adrian?
Wonderful. Thanks for coming today on a nice Friday afternoon. We'll try to keep it to an hour so that we're all good. Kind of a context for overview with the K-State first book this year being The Unthinkable. We tried to have an effort to gather what ended up with these four here to be some of our on-campus experts to talk about preparedness and resilience and obviously disasters. So hopefully today doesn't become one of those disasters, but in the context of campus activities, we want you to know that there are many things thought about and planned for at K-State, but it's not just K-State. These are issues that affect all of our lives, whether you're sitting at this institution or going to another one sometime in your life. All these things will affect you personally or could impact you personally. And that's kind of the purpose of our discussion, is to frame your mind into a sense of preparedness to where you don't have to be a victim, which if you've gone through the book, you'll hear about the plight of various victims or how not to be a victim. So with those comments in mind, I would turn it over here to Chad to kick us off to talk about some of the hazards of technology and a couple other infrastructure areas.
Yeah, so, again, I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at K-State, but I also serve as the IT COO. So that means all things infrastructure and cybersecurity. I'm part of that team that supports that here on campus. And I could tell you, part of my job, number one, is to be paranoid, to think about all the things that can potentially go wrong. Since I arrived to campus 4.5 years ago, we've had a couple of them. We had the fire at Hale that impacted our data center, 400,000 gallons of water slapped through the data center. And then, of course, the COVID incident response. But again, to try to avoid specific type of disasters, because as you all know, you pay attention, we have disasters that happen in this country all the time. We just, a lot of people just lived through Ian. We have people in the IT unit within K-State that they lived in the path of Ian. So we had to make accommodations for them. I understand that some people even came and are staying. I don't know if they've gone back yet, maybe this weekend, but they came and stayed with some of their coworkers here in Manhattan. So these are the types of things that K-State, especially in IT, with us having a lot of remote workers, we have to think about all of these disasters. Being in Midwest, you think about tornadoes, you think about possible fires, you think about those types of things. Usually a hurricane's not going to make it this far. But with the distributed way work happens, we do have to think about that. And we have to think of contingency plans for all types of disasters. From a cybersecurity perspective, it's not unheard of. And you may have heard of some universities in the past 2 or 3 years that have gone out of business because of ransomware and other types of attacks. They couldn't recover from them, and they didn't have the financial means to recover for them. The cyber insurance companies that cover us from a cyber liability, they're paying attention to this as well. And it's getting very difficult for universities as a whole to carry and maintain cyber liability insurance. So very real likelihood of us having an incident someday that could potentially have us activate our insurance. If you ever meet a CISO that tells you that your organization's hack-proof, fire them, because there's no such thing as a hack-proof organization. And K-State certainly has its fair share of vulnerabilities that can be potentially exploited. So I guess in the context of the book is, and I genuinely believe this, is you have to be prepared for protecting yourself. And from a technology standpoint, what that really means, and we saw this in Ian, is these become a paperweight. So you cannot rely on a cell phone to be your emergency form of communication. your emergency source of information, it won't work. Cell phones didn't work in Ian. Think about this. I've been in some other disasters. I used to live in North Carolina, so I've been through a couple of hurricanes. When bad things happen, such as, heaven forbid, an active shooter on campus, everybody picks these up and starts trying to use them. They quit working. If you've ever been to a K-State football game, it's really hard to send texts. It's really hard to make and receive phone calls because of the saturation of the network. And that's on a football field that, quite frankly, we've sunk millions of dollars into shoring up that infrastructure to support more cell phones than what you might think. Every corner, every flat surface of that football facility has a repeater or some kind of cellular repeater device sitting on it, trying to make that experience better for people because people expect their phones to work. That type of infrastructure doesn't exist outside of that football field. So if something bad happens, you can plan on that network being so saturated that you're not going to be able to make phone calls. You're not going to be able to check whatever your favorite social media network is, Twitter, whatever it may be, to find out what's going on. So you have to prepare yourself mentally and start thinking those things through. And how are you going to deal with the anxiety of being in the middle of an emergency and not being able to get in touch with your loved ones to see if they're okay or to let them know that you're okay? You have to think through these things and think to yourself, how do I respond so you don't become one of the victims the books talks about? You can be one of the ones that's mentally prepared to move yourself to where you can respond and function as a human. And that's not always easy to do. We get so dependent on these things. Think about when you have a blackout at your house, right? You just like sitting around thinking your cell phone will still work, but you start thinking about how much you depend on that power. If that's not there, what are you going to do? So these are the types of things we're paid to sit there and think about. It's part of our job at K-State, and we run tabletop exercises for these exact scenarios. And I can tell you, almost never does an actual emergency go the way you think that it does in a tabletop exercise. One last anecdote, and I'm going to shut up, I promise. I've been through, probably at this point in my career, at least 100 tabletop exercises for disaster response. I came from healthcare. So we did a lot of tabletop exercises in healthcare at the hospital systems. And I think the biggest one for us when we did have the fire at the data center and all systems were down, not a single K-State system was up and operational. You always think about email is important. Communications is important. We've got to get the website up so that people can know what's going on and why things are down. The number one critical system, and this has never come up in a single tabletop I've ever done, was payroll. You got to get people paid. And when we were in the middle of the actual emergency, everybody was we were a week away from enrollment during the summer. Everybody's fear was, we don't have a way to pay our staff and faculty. We've got to get this fixed because people have to have their paychecks. So while it's great to be prepared, and I think it puts you in a better mental state to respond, and we were able to respond because of our mental state and we were prepared to do things, there's going to always be that unexpected. Something doesn't go the way you think it will. So you got to prepare yourself mentally for that as well so that you can function and respond.
Thank you. With that, Dr. Brace, it's your turn.
Now I'm worried. I don't think I'm going to make things better. So I'm going to talk about sort of, mentally, what's our status as opposed to technologically. And well, the good news is that you are all the end result of thousands and thousands of generations of people who are at least smart enough to survive and have children. The downside of that is that to do that, your minds that you inherited from them are fantastically designed to deal with the threats of previous centuries. So dealing with predators, dealing with storms when they're right on you, hunkering down and so on. We are great at that. We are great at reading other people, especially face to face. The problem is that we're now in the modern world, we have a lot of new things that our brains are not designed to do. Dealing with when the last couple of years we discovered, Zoom is fantastic. It is not at all, it's like cold pizza compared to, the warm, fresh from the oven version of face-to-face interaction. and, driving cars, flying in planes, going into space, seeing weather forecasts of things that will happen in the future that there's absolutely no sign of in your present environment. Our minds are not designed to deal with those. This is, if you want, this is called mismatch theory, the idea that our evolved brains don't fit with modern environments. And that causes lots of problems. What do we do about it? You know what to do about it because, well, you're at a university, and the major way we deal with all this mismatch is education, right? Our brain is not designed to read. Our brain is designed to adopt, spontaneously learn natural language, speaking and hearing. But to read, you have to go through deliberate practice and make effort to learn it. So to prepare for disasters, we have to recognize that a lot of these disasters are things that we are not going to be automatically prepared to do. And so we have to practice, we have to develop skills so that we have the ability to react to them in a more appropriate way rather than doing things like, freeze, because that way the predator won't eat you, because that's not a real common scenario these days for us. Yeah, so there's a message in the book, but also here is the way we get past in disasters that our minds are not prepared to deal with. We want to get through the denial phase, which means recognizing the situation, which is going to be often something novel. Doing the deliberation quickly, which means being able to understand all the relevant information and parameters, and then getting to that, decision phase where you actually take an appropriate action. So we can do it. It's just going to take a lot of work. Sounds like technology.
Wonderful. Next up, Dr. Scolio, whose research group, they study problems of critical infrastructure robustness with interconnected networks. Or correct me if I...
No, it is correct. It is correct. One of the topic of our research is related to the robustness of the critical infrastructures. Actually, this is a very big deal for DHS that few years ago defined the different sectors that are part of the critical infrastructures. And they are, for example, communication, energy, food, transportation, healthcare. These are really critical for our society to survive and can be the target of some attacks. So protecting them is really critical. And not only protecting them as separate entities, but also because they are often interdependent, interconnected, means that a failure in one of these systems that can represent it as a network can percolate down to the other network, and then you can have easily and soon a very catastrophic spreading of failure. So lack of several services suddenly and simultaneously. So that is really a very critical point for our research, how to make these systems that take from this interconnectedness a lot of good points, because there are a lot of advantages. But then on the other side, there are also these disadvantages of this vulnerability. And so, for example, going back to the example of Chad, when we have our cell phone to do many things, to do our banking, to do our point-to-point communication with friends, with family, to get news, to get the weather, to open the door. I just opened in my office the door with the phone. So you do everything. Open the garage door with your cell phone. If you don't have the cell phone, what happens? So I think that is a very critical point, that we need to be aware of the level of our interdependency and create to be safe in case of emergency, some level of diversity. I think this concept of diversity is extremely important and critical, also in infectious diseases. If you have a single crop and you have a disease, for that crop, everything is gone, right? But if you have different, I learned from plant pathologists, if you have different crops, maybe the disease will kill one, but not the other. So diversity is very important in nature, is very important in several applications, but also in this case. So for example, it's important to have not only the cell phone, but being able to use a traditional phone, being able to have some money, not just through electric. So all these things that allows you to have some diversity, and you can take care of some of those activities independently. I have another thing to say, that the book recommends people to be prepared in case of disasters. So you need to have a plan. But there is another very important concept in complex systems that says that the result of a complex system is not just what you can imagine by studying the behavior of each individual, but there is also some emergent behavior that comes from the behavior of everybody. So if, for example, thinking about living in a rush building, if everyone will irrationally go into the same door, so maybe that can be a very disastrous solution, because maybe people can push each other and many people can die. So maybe people are just doing whatever they are instructed to do, go to the closest exit and go out. But actually it's very important not only to develop a plan for yourself, but also a plan for collective behavior, because the result of the collective behavior is extremely important and sometimes can be unexpected. And so that is another thing. And I want to add that the last thing is that I believe that in the future, virtual reality can really help a lot in training for disasters, because what happens, we read in the book that it's very important to create a behavior that is kind of natural. When something happens, without thinking too much, I know what to do. But to do that, I need to be trained. And this training requires people to be kind of used to those things. And so I believe that maybe not now, but in the future, virtual reality can be really the way where you can have people, so many, how many you want, to be part of, for example, leaving a building because of fire, without the fire, but because it's through this application. I believe the applications of virtual reality are still in the initial phase, but definitely for emergency and training response, I believe that virtual reality can really play a very important role. And that's it.
Right. Dr. Stack, you're up now to tell us a little bit about food and food systems, perhaps.
I like food. Mm-hmm. When we think of hunger and food shortages, typically our minds are drawn to other parts of the planet. And that's reasonable, because the United States is one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. And we have some of the most well-developed food production and distribution systems. So to imagine food shortages here would really be unthinkable. Approximately 85% of the population of the United States lives within 15 miles of a grocery store that sells almost anything we need or want, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. 364 if they close for Christmas. So it would be unthinkable for someone, you, to be unable to acquire all the food and water you need to remain healthy, wouldn't it? Where does our food come from? The grocery store. But where does the grocery store, where do our restaurants get the food that we enjoy here in Manhattan? Or where do our dining commons and restaurants on campus get their food? From everywhere. We don't grow bananas in Kansas. How does that food get here? Most of it comes on trucks. And transportation systems are dependent upon people, they're dependent upon energy, and they're dependent upon communications. So disruptions to any one of those systems could, and in fact does, lead to food shortages. Are there any examples of food shortages that resulted from the disruption of a system of some type? Well, we don't have to think back too far to COVID-19. There were many scientists around the nation, including some here at K-State, that had predicted the potential for a pandemic to disrupt society. That part was easy. But very few had explicitly included the impacts of a pandemic on the globally integrated supply chains that underpin food distribution systems. There are very few that included that in the assessments. Remember the empty shelves? What about war? Well, Egypt gets about 50% of its wheat from Ukraine. Tunisia and Spain each get over 30% of their wheat from Ukraine. Bangladesh gets a significant portion of its wheat from Ukraine. So when the war began and the ports were closed off and those distribution channels shut down, that led to shortages. But it also led to the inability to purchase food because it drove the price up in many of those countries. The United Nations World Food Program estimated that 300 to 400 million people experienced food shortages as a direct consequence of the Ukraine war. And that's not over. What about the confluence of factors? Several things coming together that together caused these disruptions. Well, again, we don't have to go back that far to the massive disruptions in the global food system in 2008 and again in 2011. They were caused by a confluence of a spike in energy costs that impacted transportation, that there were the massive diversion up to 20% of the global maize crop to biofuels, and China opening up to the world and starting to import massive amounts of grain from around the world. Those three things came together and it resulted in food riots and protests in over 35 nations and the overthrow of 2 governments. So yeah, those things happen. Food security is about the availability of food. Is it there? As well as the affordability, the ability to access that food. Do you have the resources necessary to acquire what's on the shelves? Food is a commodity that must be purchased. You've already heard discuss ramifications of a power grid failure and some of the things that you can't account for. Let's extend that to food and water. I was recently in a city in the eastern United States where most of the restaurants and local grocers were digital only. They did not accept cash. If you go to the grocery stores in Manhattan, you'll see now they have separate lanes that are debit, credit only. You can't use cash to purchase your groceries. So now imagine that the power goes down. There's a power grid failure. How do you buy food? How do you get cash to buy food if the ATMs don't work? If you don't have communication systems, how do you find out where to get food? Do you have a plan? Should the unthinkable occur, do you have a plan? How will you acquire food and water if the stores have no means to transact sales? Do you have a close network of friends that you can connect with in the event of some unthinkable event? How will you get information regarding the nature and extent of whatever that event was? and where to acquire the needs you have. Do you have a social network? Do you have a plan? The National Academy of Sciences recently published the proceedings of a workshop on disaster response and resilience. And they concluded one of the most important preparedness elements you can have is to have a network of people to connect with. That is a foundational element of resilience, according to the National Academy of Sciences. So how will you get information? How will you acquire food and water? Those are things to think about. Do you have a network of people you can connect with? As discussed earlier, you are largely responsible for your outcomes. You need to have a plan. Be prepared, have a plan. Back to you, Adrian.
Thank you. I guess a segue from that, we've talked about power, electricity, people, infrastructures like transportation and food. If we can give I guess an overview here that there are systems and processes in place all the way from the United Nations globally down to the federal government, to state governments, to county governments to do some of this, even to the institutional level of an organization like Kansas State. So we're not starting at zero, but I guess my question would be to kick off, what happens when some of those systems move to zero, when we are without power? And I guess we'll start with you, Chad, because what are the alternatives?
So I guess I just want to say, I don't know that there is any other than preparing for yourself and your family. This comes up a lot when we talk about, when we go through, audits with different groups from a technology perspective. And I think it doesn't just relate to technology. I think we all know, it was widely reported that most grocery stores have 3 days worth of food. We're pretty much a just-in-time society when it comes to food. So as if this isn't scary enough, if we have a big enough disaster, do you really think, and this is a conversation I have with auditors all the time, do you really think that truck drivers are going to be on the road delivering food? Do you think people are going to be in the grocery stores to sell the product? Or do you think everybody's going to be at home protecting their family and caring about their family? We have this conversation with auditors a lot. They get frustrated with us when we say our data centers were in a better place now because we moved to the cloud. But my old data center at the hospital, we were 32 miles door to door from 2 data centers. And every year without fail, the auditors would say, what if you have a disaster big enough that it takes out both your data centers? What are you going to do? Mm-hmm. My response to that was, I don't care what happens at work if there's something that's big enough to take out 32 miles of a metropolitan area the size of Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't care. I'm staying at home and taking care of my family. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person in this supply chain or in whatever job they do that has very similar feelings. A job is a job. Now, I'm not saying I won't get back there eventually if I still have a job, or if they let me go, that so be it. But at the end of the day, you're going to take care of you and yours first. And to me, that's part of what this book talks about, is you have to have that mindset. And it's almost of a point of greed. And we've learned as a society, and we've learned since we were kids, that we need to share. Are you still willing to be that person in the event of a disaster? It's up to you to think about. You got to prepare for those, because if you are a person that is prepared, if you are a person that has things, and if we are at zero, you're going to have people knocking on your door if you share that information. So how are you going to respond to that? So these things go through my mind, personally as well as professionally, because I've been involved in a lot of this stuff. And it's scary to think about, and it's not a place you want to go. But I think the more prepared you are, the more you think about the worst case scenario, the better off you'll be, because it's highly unlikely that this worst case scenario ever comes to be, but you'll at least be ready if it ever does.
Well, keying off you and yours, I want to talk about people now. Dr. Braze, how do we get people mentally prepared? How do we get them? What are some good strategies to get them to move through the denial stage cognitively to work or implement their preparedness to solve whatever dilemmas that'll be heading their way?
Right. So again, the word preparation comes up a lot, and you don't have to go, full prepper have a basement. You can if you want, but having some basic precautions, having some cash on hand, having things written down as opposed to being all stored electronically of critical information, things like that. Similarly, preparing mentally, thinking about, okay, if we lose power, hopefully you can start thinking about that. How are you going to get your car out of the garage if the garage door doesn't work? There's a way to do that. It's not hard. But if you thought about it ahead of time, it's going to be a lot easier when you're stressed out in a situation where you need to. Thinking about, that people do tend to go to take care of their families. And this is a sort of an impulse that is pretty deeply entrenched in our psychology as far as what's called kin altruism. And we can override that to some extent, but it's always going to be a battle, and it's battle. Sometimes people decide not to fight. Sometimes they fight it and they lose. And to understand those sorts of dynamics in yourself and in others, but going through scenarios, just like we try to do tabletop exercises on how technology is going to fail and what's going to happen there. What happens when psychology fails or things just go sideways? How do you handle that? And how do you thinking those through can give you a higher level of competence to deal with the situation if it ever does happen. That will give you more confidence that you know what to do, that you have some idea, and of course allow you the breathing room to do those things and have integrity while you're doing them instead of behaving rashly.
I have a question about this family thing.
Yeah.
So I believe that if it is a long time emergency, maybe this is the case, but there are many other cases where you can first take care of your family, put your family in a safe condition, and then go back and help others, which is also something you can do, right? If it is a cosmic catastrophe that is holding for days and days, maybe that is really something very, but if it is, for example, you see a lot of cases like flooding in Houston, there were a lot of people helping each other. I think they did that after putting their family members in a safe condition and then going back to help others, or going back to work to help re-establish those services.
Yeah, and we see that with every disaster, where eventually once people get to a point where they feel they're in a good place or they're in a safe place, or they weren't directly impacted, there's always those that'll reach out to help. But we also need to remember the flip side of that. There's always there'll be those that look to exploit that situation and take advantage of it. So you got to be mindful of that. And I genuinely, coming across as a big pessimist today, I realize that. But I think by and large, people are good. And I think by and large, people do want to help. And I think that's the critical point. Once you get to a safe spot, you do feel like you can go back and contribute. So while I talked, I'm going to take care of my family, I will. I also have a drive that I owe a level of service to this organization, because they're the ones that allow me to put food on my table. They're the ones that allow me to have a roof over my head. So there is that obligation, and I think we all feel that pull. So eventually, I believe a majority of us will do the right thing, but we need to prepare mentally for those first, who knows, 1-2 weeks, maybe. So anything beyond that's pretty far out there, I think.
So do you think in things like tabletop exercises, those should be built in, and those exercises should include, here's how we're going to assure that people will know their families are taken care of so they can focus on getting other responsibilities done? The
way I've seen that done in tabletops is you remove players from the board, right? And it's literally a board game type scenario. And you say, okay, we know, depending on the situation, 20% of you, for whatever reason, are not going to be at work. Therefore, you randomly select 20% of people that are players at the board, and you remove them from the equation. Sometimes you'll make it all of an entire department that's gone, depending on the scenario. So yes, you should practice those things. And I can tell you in some scenarios I've been, the entire IT team has been taken off the board as players. And the response was, okay, you have no IT people, you have no nerds to come in and fix the technology. What do you do if your technology is down? Because your technologists aren't coming to work. And I think that's a real risk for K-State because we are so distributed now. We've made a concentrated effort for various reasons to hire people from all over the United States. There's a possibility that a large chunk of IT wouldn't come back to work or couldn't. You know, if they're remote and things are down, they might not be able to get to things but hands-on.
I think all of these have the challenge of scale, both spatial and temporal.
Right.
So it depends on how big an event this is and for how long does it last. That complicates everything.
Yes.
And, you know, the comment about not everybody is going to have everyone else's best interest at stake. I'll never forget, I was involved in a National Academy's workshop on pandemic preparedness. This is a few years back. But it was a desktop exercise, and they actually had this took place in Kansas City. They had fire chief, police chief, they had emergency management, they had 2 representatives of different network media stations. So they had a lot of the people that would be involved. And one of the biggest take homes for me, I was stunned by this. So they had a film and they'd run it and say, here we are at this stage. What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? So it was really instructional. It was great. But when they got to the press said, well, the first thing we're going to do is try to tie up all the experts so that we're the only credible source of information. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, isn't that kind of the last thing we want is only one place people can get information? But yeah, not everybody has, but that's their game. They're competing with that other network. And I was shocked by that actually, but it makes sense if you're looking at it as a business.
Yes, that is against diversity. But I was wondering also this morning, we heard that 2 big food supermarket companies are merging. Is this going to be a greater vulnerability for availability of food or not?
So we were just having this conversation before this event started. So, you know, one of the reasons you have these mergers is increased efficiency.
Right. And that
but
always
increased
happens.
Efficiency increases vulnerability.
Exactly.
Almost without exception. And so, no, it's not a good thing.
I agree. It's also in other systems that this happens. You are become more efficient, optimize, but optimization is against robustness because robustness is being able to respond to different working conditions, but you optimize for that specific working condition. But when you move from that working condition, your performance goes down a lot.
That's, I think, the news of Kroger and Albertson was kind of the first big ticket for Wall Street coming out of COVID to announce their merger. And because it involves food, I know it caught my interest, but as we learned in COVID, a lot of our just-in-time inventory, lean, efficient inventory methods of keeping food around, just-in-time doesn't always work when there's a blip. So as we move from just-in-time to something more like just in case, are we going to see better availability at a more localized level? When we talk about only 3 days worth of food supply on the shelves at your local grocery store, are there alternative ways? Does the land-grant universities, do they have a play in trying to make a better landscape for operating in a disaster in any preparedness sense? I toss that to any of you.
I just want to do a shout out. I didn't take advantage of it because I didn't need any, but I do know that when flour was impossible to get, K-State, the Milling Science Department gave folks, I think 5 pounds of flour, if I remember right. So I think, you know, I'm sorry, it was 20. Oh, maybe I should have got some. But, you know, all that being said, you know, so I think we should show a history of, at least in this community, reaching out. I don't know that I heard of any other universities doing that, but I know K-State at least did that.
Well, we had a mention from the crowd. Are there any other burning questions out there? Yeah, go ahead.
You haven't mentioned older people and what they know and their experiences. like we talked about, if there was no money. I worked in Ireland when there was bank strike. So you couldn't deposit money, you couldn't withdraw money. It went on for maybe 6 months. I mean, it was a long time. I don't remember exactly, but it was month after month after month. And we managed quite well. I mean, businesses, of course, back then, everybody didn't have a credit card. So you had certain businesses that would take cash, and then they could pay the people who work there in cash. But cash flow around in the society carried on like nothing really happened. And I mean, I have a lot of experiences like that.
But now it is different.
Right again, no phone and no mail. And this again went on for a long time, maybe not 6 months, but a few months. And I remember telex. And I managed to send a telex. I wonder how many years ago a telex is. But so I wasn't worried. I had flowers and water. I had bread.
That is correct. Actually, that was something I think in the past was happening, that all these systems were more separated. So you have system not so interdependent. So people were used to have money to do things, call with a telephone or send a telegram or different type of things. I think the tendency for efficiency has been to integrate everything, having a single device to do everything. And that, I think, is the different scenario that we are facing now.
Yeah, and if your only means of getting your salary is an electronic deposit at your bank of choice, and the systems are down, you're kind of stuck. You can't just go somewhere and purchase something.
And for Zoom, because I know recording this, I'm going to repeat in just a real quick synopsis of what you're saying is, but I think the book touches on it when it talks about building your network. So your point is people have all types of different experience. And just like diversity is important across the board when we talk about work and hiring a diverse workforce, same thing goes for your network that you build to prepare yourself. That the gained experience from people that have been on this earth longer is absolutely relevant. I don't know another technology spin on. I don't know how many people have seen this video on YouTube, but there was a gentleman who offered his grandchildren $20 or $50 if they could use a rotary phone. And the kids had no idea how to use a rotary phone. So it was, obviously meant to be humorous, but it's truth. So in the event of a disaster, if rotary phones are the only things working, how many, even college age students will know how to use a rotary phone? So when you're building your network, to your point, I think it's important that you have a diverse view of people that should be part of your networking. Gardening's another one. I spent a couple of years at the community garden here, and it was amazing how much I learned from just seeing people that had been gardening for a lot longer than I have, what they knew, what skills they had, and suggestions they made. And I know this has been a horrible tomato year. This has been one of my best tomato years. Right. And I know a lot of people that haven't had any. And I credit it all to those years I spent at that community garden learning from others, tips, tricks, and other things you can do. So I think your point is valid. And as we build these communities of people that we trust, it's important that we get that diversity included in it as well.
Wonderful. Anyone else out there with some input for the panel? If so, just raise your hand. We'll get to you. Well, we've talked about power infrastructure, people, transportation, critical infrastructures, and food. What have we missed as an institution? Thinking now down to the K-State level. What can our university do to help prepare our people better? Any thoughts, anyone?
I don't know about this in particular, but we had a project with Gary. We were working on the kind of protection of beef cattle industry. considered as one critical infrastructure connected with the transportation network, right? Because you need a lot of transportation to manage the different phases, stages of the cattle growth up to the slaughterhouse. And we were studying not only the dependency, but also the human behavior. And I remember that a very important point was that we had to divide the people in two big categories, the risk tolerant and instead the risk adverse people. And so that was really a critical thing and was kind of creating a different behavior completely. The people that are risk adverse try to have those plans, try to be considering what if scenarios, but there are a lot of people that instead want to take risks, and those people are less careful on those. And so we need to consider that the society has a mix of these behaviors, and so that can have an impact on the outcome of this type of catastrophe.
I'll pick on Dr. Stack being the representative from College of Ag. Oh, go ahead.
I had a question, and it is kind of passed to the College of Ag on this. So I was reading an article yesterday that pointed out that there are 6 major bread baskets in the world. Russia and Ukraine are combined to be one of the largest, producing 25% of the world's wheat and 18% of the world's corn. With this, we also see with the war currently between those two countries that there's going to be a huge shortage and millions are going to suffer. But that is mostly pointed towards Europe. On the United States end, and especially if we add in the fact that inflation is continuing to rise from those food sources, how is this going to affect Americans? How is this going to affect us when we go to purchase bread and other foods at our grocery stores? And how do we plan ahead on that?
Yeah, well, almost without exception, we are in global food systems. So almost without exception, a major perturbation in anywhere in the system impacts everywhere in the system. I would maybe add a little bit to your comment about the impact of Russia and Ukraine with respect to wheat and corn. It's not just Europe. It's Northern Africa and it's Southern Asia that are going to be impacted the greatest by that disruption, not Europe. But I think I'm trying to, here are a couple of good examples. So that prolonged drought that we had in Australia, okay, that distorted wheat prices globally. The prolonged impact in the previous decade in Ukraine of a drought impacted global prices. So every nation imports and exports. Now, they import, we are one of the world's leading producers of wheat. We export a lot. And we import a lot. It's just the way the systems work. And so when anything causes a spike in prices, it affects everybody. There's no escaping that right now. So the price increases that are going to result from a prolonged war in Ukraine are going to impact everybody's cost across the board. It's just that some nations can deal with that cost better than others, either by replacements or by just affluence. And so that's the big concern of the World Food Program right now is some of the nations that are dependent upon those products don't have the resources to deal with this. So they're going to compete with other nations, which drives up the prices. It's essentially what happened, speaking of networks, in 2008, those spikes in the prices of the basic staple crops kind of enlightened people to the importance of nodes that people weren't paying attention to. So with respect to rice, I think it was Vietnam that all of a sudden embargoed their rice, and it disrupted like 15 nodes in that distribution system, driving the prices up in all of those other countries. So I don't think anybody escapes this. the longer that war goes on, and we just had a seminar a week ago and an update to that. And the challenge is that even though there are a lot of silos full of grain right now in the Ukraine, which will satisfy the short term, the prospects for a normal planting season are very low. And so it's really looking down the road 2 and 3 years from now that these impacts are going to play out. So even if the war ends, say, within the next few months by the end of the calendar year, which there's no real evidence for that, but even if it does, the impacts are going to continue for at least another 2-3 years until Ukraine can get back on a normal production scale. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. That was a yes.
If we could follow that track, because I think I either read or I heard something similar to that. So when the United States talk about silos, hold the reserves in grain. And it's almost like, oil reserves, et cetera. There was a discussion in the past couple of days that the U.S. reserve of grains is anywhere between 3 and 12 days. We're at a critical point where it won't take very much. It could be an energy related issue that requires some kind of different approach to something. But the essence, regardless of whether it's 3 or 12, it doesn't make any difference. And the point is that the discussion was we're at the precipice of a potential catastrophic issue globally. How do we respond to that? Can we respond?
Yeah, so it's not, Joel, it's not a matter of whether you need a bunker, it's how big. No, of course, it's not that bad. I'm not sure where those figures came from. But, we should be concerned, okay? But I don't lose sleep over this because countries are continuing to produce. We have 2 hemispheres. So when we're not producing, the Southern Hemisphere is producing. Those grains get shipped all over the world. So we import, we export. For most of the staple crops, the top 10 producers are usually in the top 10 importers too. So a lot of things are going across borders. And so even though we don't have a big reserve stock, you have to wait and see what plays out over a course of a full production cycle, which is now a year. It's not just the months that are in your country. So it's a global system. We're tied into a global system for all of these major commodities.
So your point is stay calm.
Stay calm. Well, so they wanted keep calm and carry on. I wanted don't worry, be happy. So.
But what about adapting what we produce, for example, what the countries produce? There is any way to adapt for a better responding? Because you have 1 year, right? Was cycle.
There's some flexibility, but don't forget agriculture is heavily technology dependent. Some of that is specific to the crops that you're producing. So there's some ability to adapt. But Kansas is not all of a sudden going to become a big vegetable producer. Right. We don't have a lot of the infrastructure. We don't have the environment to support that. And so there's some ability to adapt, but it's not great. We're not going to become a citrus state.
Sure. No, but for example, corn that can be eaten by people, not just for animals.
Yep, that could be adapted, yeah. But it's a competitive system. So it gets to price. And it's hard to predict these things. I mean, just remember again, back to COVID and what was happening in COVID. We had a shortage of N95 masks. We had a company that produced them that was exporting them out of the US because they had pre-existing contracts.
Right.
That's the way all our systems function. And it will be difficult to break those practices. So I think that, you asked about K-State, and I'm pondering that. I would guess that most of us have no idea what K-State's preparedness plans are. I mean, I have no idea. So when we talk about any of these potential disasters, what's the plan mostly for the students, that live here or live in the vicinity of campus? What's the plan? I'm guessing they exist. I'm just saying I wouldn't know what to advise students to do. And so maybe we need some more broad education on, awareness of what the resources might be. I talked about the social network thing. Well, okay, they get together and then what? Is there a better place to get them together? Is there a plan that says they should be here? I don't know that. And maybe I should. And, some of that might be, there might be a plan published in our policy manual. I have no idea. But maybe just some educational programs to raise awareness of what either resources or what thinking has already gone into these challenges that we should be cognizant of. I have no idea, and that's on me.
I think Marty had a question, or not anymore.
Well, I had a question, but this takes us down a completely different rabbit hole. Maybe you should save for another day.
Okay.
I'm almost afraid to ask Marty.
Well, yeah, I think we might be at a good stopping point with Dr. Stask's comments.
I did have a very quick question in response to that. So when you talk about those preparedness plans, and it's not all your fault. I'm the emergency manager here, and I've been here about a year, and we're building some things. And I guess my question would be, how would you recommend getting that out to people and getting the buy-in for some of these things?
So not just by cell phone.
Right.
I would say, this is called the Unthinkable, and we can always prepare, it's Kansas, we could prepare for things like a tornado and so on, but this is about things that we don't think about. Yeah. So rather than focus on, here's what you do in a tornado, here's what you do in, a pandemic or whatever, work on developing skills, get the information to people and get them thinking about it so they can prepare and be mentally and physically prepared. Like the CDC, sometimes they do these exercises where they talk about how to prepare for a zombie apocalypse. Not because we actually we actually think there's going to be a zombie apocalypse, but because a lot of the preparations are heavily overlapping with what you would do for other types of disasters. So it's a focus on helping people understand how they can prepare separate from, here's what K-State's going to do. Here's, because a lot of it's going to depend on what exactly the thing is that happened.
So what are the channels you use to do that?
I would use a public service announcement at the football games, at the basketball games. I would make sure you get information out to departments, academic units. It doesn't have to be like a constant full court press, but Savannah, I'm glad you're on board for one. But it's just, I don't even know what exists and what doesn't exist. So again, I wouldn't know how to advise students, but there are lots of student groups that you could bring into the fold and, kind of train the trainer type model to communicate information in a broader way, probably more effectively student to student than, oh, it's just a professor saying that. So I think there are a lot of avenues to explore to get that information out.
Yes. There is a network effect also in spreading information.
All right. Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. So I want to thank our panelists and have everyone give them a hand. Let Dr. Levnick sign us out here with a few comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Adrian, for spearheading this. All I wanted to do was just to note that the Global Food Systems Initiative and the National Agricultural Biosecurity Center hosted this event, and we really do appreciate your coming. Thank you so much to the panel. This has been recorded, so we will post it out on the Global Food Systems website when we get it prepared to do that. So again, thank you so much and have a wonderful weekend.